You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. In the early stages of the American Revolutionary War, back in September 1775, the American Continental Army made a bold move by invading Quebec. However, this venture didn't pan out as they hoped, and by July 1776 they found themselves beaten and retreating to Fort Ticonderoga. Their situation worsened when a substantial British army landed in Quebec in May 1776 and chased them down. In a related clash, the Continental Navy, operating a small fleet on Lake Champlain, faced defeat at the Battle of Valcour Island in October 1776. This battle, however, had a silver lining for the Americans. The British had to pause their offensive plans to build up their fleet on the lake, which unexpectedly worked in the Americans' favor. It forced General Guy Carleton, the British commander, to postpone his plans of attacking Fort Ticonderoga that year. Carleton's troops did get alarmingly close to Ticonderoga, advancing within just 3 miles. However, the onset of winter made maintaining supply lines along the lake too difficult. So, with the season working against him and logistical challenges on the lake, Carleton decided to pull his forces back into Quebec, thus avoiding what could have been a direct and potentially decisive assault on the American position at Fort Ticonderoga. In May of 1777, General John Burgoyne made his way to Quebec to take command of the British forces stationed there. His mission was to move south, capture the strategic locations of Ticonderoga and the Hudson River Valley, and effectively split the rebel-controlled areas. His troops were made up of several British infantry regiments, namely the 9th, 20th, 21st, 24th, 47th, 53rd and 62nd, along with the King's Loyal Americans and the Queen's Loyal Rangers. They were joined by a significant number of Hessians, including Prince Ludwig's dragoons and various Jäger regiments led by commanders like Specht von Retz, von Riedesel, Prince Frederick, Erbprinz, and Bremen. Most of these forces had been in the region since 1776 and had previously been involved in pushing the American army out of Quebec. Burgoyne's regular army numbered around 7,000 strong. In addition, his forces included around 800 indigenous allies, and a smaller contingent of Canadians and Loyalists who mainly served in scouting roles. Another unique aspect of this military venture was the presence of over 1,000 civilians, including a woman expecting a child and Baroness Riedesel and her 3 young children. In total, over 10,000 people were part of Burgoyne's expedition. The strategic repositioning at Fort Saint-Jean near the top of Lake Champlain kicked off on June 14th. By June 21st, Burgoyne's armada was navigating the lake and reached the abandoned Fort Crown Point by June 30th. The advance forces, including the indigenous allies, were so effective in their scouting and reconnaissance that the American defenders at Ticonderoga had no clear idea about the size or exact position of Burgoyne's force. While moving forward, Burgoyne also penned a proclamation directed at the American forces. His message was noted for its overly grand and somewhat convoluted style, a characteristic for which he was already quite infamous. This proclamation was widely mocked and critiqued for its pompous tone. Since their capture from a small force in May 1775, American troops had been holding onto the forts at Ticonderoga and Crown Point. In the years 1776 and 1777, they poured significant resources into beefing up the defenses at Ticonderoga. They heavily fortified a peninsula on the lake's east side, now called Mount Independence, added several defensive positions to the north of the old Fort Ticonderoga, including a large fort over previous French structures and another on Mount Hope. They even built a quarter-mile floating bridge across the lake, making it easier to move between Ticonderoga and Mount Independence. Leadership at Ticonderoga saw some changes early in 1777. General Philip Schuyler had been in charge of the Continental Army's Northern Department, with General Horatio Gates overseeing Ticonderoga until 1777. In March, the Continental Congress decided to put Gates in charge of the entire department. Schuyler protested this decision, and Congress ended up reversing it in May. Gates, unhappy with the situation, left for Philadelphia. This left General Arthur St. Clair to take command of the fort, arriving just 3 weeks before the arrival of Burgoyne's army. The defending force was made up of several units that weren't at full strength, including regiments of the Continental Army and militias from New York and other nearby states. On June 20th, Generals St. Clair and Schuyler held a war council and concluded that their force, which was under 2,500 effective soldiers, was simply not enough for a proper defense. They decided that planning a retreat was the sensible move. The The plans included 2 escape routes, one by water towards Skenesborough, the southernmost navigable point of the lake, and another overland through a rugged road leading east toward Hubberton, in what is now Vermont. The American force was mainly comprised of 2 regiments, 3 combined units, and other units that didn't have their full complement of soldiers. These included Francis and Marshall's Massachusetts regiments, along with Hale's, Scilly's, and Scammell's New Hampshire Continentals. Mount Defiance, previously known as Sugarloaf, has a commanding view over Ticonderoga and Independence. It was understood that if large cannons were placed on this height, defending the fort would be out of the question. This strategic flaw was highlighted by John Trumbull during the time General Gates was in charge. Despite the common belief that it was impossible for the British to haul cannons up there, Trumbull, alongside Anthony Wayne and a wounded Benedict Arnold, climbed the peak and noticed that it indeed was feasible to drag up gun carriages. The decision on what to do with Sugarloaf was further tangled by the general belief that Fort Ticonderoga, often dubbed the Gibraltar of the North, must be defended at all costs. The options of both abandoning the fort or merely stationing a small force there to fend off a minor threat, but not a full-scale attack, were seen as politically unacceptable moves. Defending the fort and its surrounding defences would require the full force present, leaving no one to guard Sugarloaf. Furthermore, George Washington and the Congress were under the impression that General Burgoyne, known to be stationed in Quebec, would likely attack from the south by moving his troops by sea to New York City. After a war council held on June 20th, Schuyler tasked St. Clair with holding out as long as possible, while ensuring he wasn't trapped with no way to retreat. Schuyler himself prepared a reserve force of 700 in Albany, and Washington instructed that 4 regiments be on standby at Peekskill, further south along the Hudson River. On July 1st, General St. Clair did not realize just how strong Burgoyne's army was, even though it was only 4 miles away. Burgoyne had cleverly positioned Fraser's leading forces on the west side of the lake with the aim to surround Mount Hope. At the same time, Riedesel and his German troops were placed on the east side, targeting Mount Independence and the route to Hubberton. Burgoyne set these plans into motion on July 2nd. On the morning of July 2nd, realizing the vulnerable position at Mount Hope, St. Clair decided to pull back his forces from this location. The soldiers quickly set their defences on fire and withdrew to the old French lines, a historic defence site from the 1758 Battle of Carillon. They managed to escape just before Burgoyne's leading troops got there. That afternoon, British soldiers and indigenous allies attacked, but didn't come close enough to cause significant damage. St. Clair told his men to wait before shooting. However, James Wilkinson fired prematurely at a British soldier, prompting the rest to shoot. The British soldier appeared to fall dead but was later found unharmed, just drunk. St. Clair cleverly got information from the soldier by pretending to capture him along with a fake loyalist. By July 3rd, Fraser's troops took control of Mount Hope. Burgoyne then sent some scouts and indigenous allies across the lake for spying and moved some German troops to the west. British camps came close enough to American lines to be under gunfire, but this didn't stop the British from fixing bridges on the crucial path between Ticonderoga and Lake George. The British engineers spotted the strategic value of Sugarloaf Mountain. With the Americans pulled back from Mount Hope, the British started building gun placements on Sugarloaf from July 2nd, doing it so quietly that the Americans wouldn't notice. Pulling their larger guns up the slope took days. Burgoyne planned to launch his major assault only when the German forces were in place to cut off the American retreat. On the 4th of July, Americans marked the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence with a low-key celebration that included some toasts. That evening, their secrecy was compromised when some Native Americans ignited fires on Sugarloaf, tipping off the Americans to their presence. The following morning, on the 5th of July, St. Clair convened a war council where it was decided to retreat due to their compromised position. They opted to wait until darkness to move, in order to keep their departure hidden. St. Clair, in a moment of candour with a quartermaster, remarked on the tough choice before him. He could either stand his ground, preserving his personal reputation but potentially sacrificing his troops, or he could pull back, saving his troops but risking his own reputation. He was acutely aware of the likely political fallout from his decision. More than 200 boats were loaded with weapons, the injured, camp followers and supplies to start a cautious journey up the lake towards Skenesborough, led by Colonel Pierce Long's regiment. Due to not having enough boats, they had to leave behind 4 of the injured, the biggest cannons, and various supplies ranging from tents to livestock. The rest of the soldiers made their way across to Mount Independence and took the Hubberton Road, which Riedesel's forces had not yet reached. A small group was stationed at the pontoon bridge, with cannons ready to fire at any British trying to cross. but they were found intoxicated when the British approached the next morning. The British managed to take over the forts without any resistance, and detachments from Fraser's and Riedessel's troops began chasing the American forces retreating down the Hubberton Road. Meanwhile, Burgoyne was quick to move some of his troops up the lake towards Skanesborough. Before they retreated, at least 7 Americans lost their lives, and another 11 were injured during skirmishes. The British also faced losses, with at least 5 of their men killed. Despite these challenges, the American troops moved quickly along the Hubberton Road. By the evening of July 6th, most of them had covered a 30-mile journey to reach Castleton. The British chased after them, leading to the Battle of Hubberton on the morning of July 7th. This clash allowed the majority of the American forces to get away, and later join up with Schuyler at Fort Edward. A smaller group of Americans had taken boats to Skanesborough, and there they managed to hold off Burgoyne's leading troops in the Battle of Fort Anne. However, they were pushed to leave behind their equipment, and many of their injured and sick during skirmishes at Skanesborough. The standoff at Ticonderoga didn't significantly hinder Burgoyne's advance, but it did force him to leave behind a garrison of over 900 men in the area. He had to wait until July 11th for his scattered forces to regroup at Skanesborough. Burgoyne then faced delays on the heavily forested road to Fort Edward, which had been effectively sabotaged by General Schuyler's men. They cut down trees to block the road and destroyed all the bridges over the swampy areas. Ultimately, Burgoyne's campaign didn't succeed, leading to his surrender after the battles of Saratoga. On November 20th, General Gates informed Governor George Clinton that the British had evacuated and burned Ticonderoga and Independence during their retreat. There was a huge uproar, both politically and publicly, following the withdrawal. Congress was shocked and openly criticized Schuyler and St. Clair for the defeat, expressing deep disappointment. Famous figures like John Adams and George Washington did not mince words either. Adams said, "I think we shall never be able to defend a post until we shoot a general," clearly showing his frustration. Washington described the event as an event of chagrin and surprise, not apprehended nor within the compass of my reasoning, revealing his utter disbelief that such a thing could happen. There were even whispers going around that St. Clair and Schuyler might have betrayed their country, taking bribes to retreat. In the wake of these events, Schuyler lost his position as the commander of the Northern Department, being replaced by General Gates. This change was largely because of the mess at Ticonderoga. St. Clair found himself removed from his command as well, and was called to headquarters to face scrutiny. He stood his ground, insisting he had acted honorably, and demanded a court-martial to clear his name. But due to some behind-the-scenes political maneuvering against Washington, this court-martial didn't happen until September 1778. When it did finally take place, St. Clair was found completely innocent, though he never received another field command. Similarly, Schuyler was also acquitted by a court-martial. This event even caught the attention of Europe. King George was so thrilled he reportedly ran to the Queen, barely dressed, shouting, "I have beaten them! I have beaten all the Americans!" Meanwhile, the French and Spanish courts, who had been backing the Americans, allowing them to use their ports and trading with them, weren't pleased by the news. This development led the British to push Spain and France to close their ports to the Americans, a demand that was outright rejected, leading to increased tensions among the European powers. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.